I want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions because the topics are obviously very controversial and very interesting, I think. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, lots of disagreement. So I want to make sure there's plenty of time. So Joe will give me the timeout if I go too long. And I really want to give you time to ask questions. And I'll hang out here as well. I'll stay afterwards and you can ask me questions. All right, so I will be reading at least parts of this paper. The problem is if I don't read, then I'm not that disciplined and I will digress too much. And there is a handout, so I hope that will be helpful. I start by referring to a book that I wrote with Ben Mitchell-Yellen, Near-Death Experiences, Understanding Visions of the Afterlife. And that's more detailed in terms of some of the arguments that I'll just skip over in this talk, but I'll tell you when I get to a place where you might want to look at that book. Then I have a new book coming out in June of this year that you might be interested in. And then there is a YouTube video of a lecture I gave on near-death experiences at UC Riverside, but it's a different lecture. You might have fun with it. Okay. Near-death experiences, well, maybe I can go ahead. Near-death experiences, NDEs, take place in near-death contexts, situations in which an individual's life is in jeopardy. I've always thought maybe it should be situations in which the individual reasonably believes that her life is in jeopardy. But in any case, it's usually put this way, that the individual's life is in jeopardy. The Dutch cardiologist and researcher on NDEs, Pim van Lommel, describes NDEs as involving, quote, a range of impressions during a special state of consciousness, including a number of special elements, such as an out-of-body experience, pleasant feelings, seeing a tunnel, a light, deceased relatives, or a life review, or a conscious return to the body. So these are features characteristic of near-death experiences. I will stipulate that an NDE takes place in a near-death context and has a sufficient number of the characteristics identified by Van Lommel. Others, including Bruce Grayson, who's an MD at the University of Virginia, have studied and identified these features of NDEs. He has produced what he has called an NDE scale, which measures the degree to which an NDE possesses these elements. Four salient aspects are an out-of-body experience, OBE, i.e. an experience of floating above one's body and seeing it and its surroundings from above. So that's the way it appears to you. A life review, where your life kind of comes before you. It's sometimes presented narratively or sequentially and sometimes kind of all at once. And an experience of traveling toward a light in a dark tunnel, or perhaps crossing a river or otherwise proceeding toward a different realm. Typically, one is guided in this voyage toward a different realm by deceased loved ones or loving parental or religious figures. Various theorists have identified a range of signature features of NDEs, and they have pointed out that it is not necessary for a genuine NDE to have them all. Okay, NDEs are better thought of as a syndrome, or what philosophers following Ludwig Wittgenstein call a family resemblance notion. That is, an NDE must contain some subset of the relevant features, but it's impossible to specify the required number of features in advance, just as members of an extended family have physical features in common, but no individual has all of them, presumably, or might not have all of them. It's a family resemblance notion. Most NDEs are described as very positive experiences, and those who have had NDEs have changed their behavior significantly. Pim van Lommel has studied people who have had NDEs in the context of cardiac arrest, and he has observed that the NDEs have had notable transformational effects. These individuals have less death anxiety and are more spiritual, by and large, not everyone. They are more pro-social, appreciating relationships more, and spending more time with family, friends, and relatives. They are also more compassionate and attuned to morality and justice. The transformations are often profound. And so in his work, Pim van Lommel, the cardiologist from the Netherlands, goes through in detail the data on these transformations. NDEs are amazing, and not just because of their capacity to transform. Some near-death experience reports can be corroborated independently and some cannot. Many of the latter sort, the ones that can't be independently corroborated, describe communication with deceased relatives and confrontation with a heavenly or otherworldly realm, an environment hospitable to immortality. Consider, for example, the neurosurgeon Eben Alexander's NDE. Has anyone read his book? Okay, good. In which he found himself in a, quote, beautiful, incredible dream world, except it wasn't a dream, end quote. He describes himself flying along with, quote, a beautiful girl with high cheekbones and deep blue eyes, end quote. Sometime after his NDE, when shown a photo of her, Alexander recognized this girl as his deceased sister, whom he had never met. He writes, quote, we were riding along together on an intricately patterned surface, alive with indescribable and vivid colors, the wing of a butterfly. In fact, millions of butterflies were all around us, vast fluttering waves of them, dipping down into the greenery and coming back up around us again. Without using any words, she spoke to me. The message had 3 parts. You are loved and cherished dearly forever. You have nothing to fear. There is nothing you can do wrong. Alexander holds that this rich set of experiences occurred while he was in a coma and his brain was not capable of having experiences. He was a neurosurgeon, or he is a neurosurgeon, so. But while I was in a coma, my brain hadn't been working improperly. It hadn't been working at all. The part of my brain that years of medical school had taught me was responsible for creating the world I lived and moved around in, and for taking the raw data that came in through my senses and fashioning it into a meaningful universe, that part of my brain was down and out. And yet, despite all of this, I had been alive and aware, truly aware, in a universe characterized above all by love, consciousness, and reality. There was, for me, simply no arguing this fact. I know it so completely that I ached. I knew it so completely that I ached. What I had experienced was more real than the house I sat in, more real than the logs burning in the fireplace. Okay, he calls it ultra-real, his experience. So Eben Alexander's Proof of Heaven, a neurosurgeon's journey into the afterlife, in which he discusses his NDE, has sold millions of copies, and it has influenced many people around the world. He also has a sequel called Map of Heaven. Alexander himself reports many transformative effects. Although he had grown up in a religious family, prior to his NDE, he had been skeptical about religion. But after his NDE, he became a believer in religion and the afterlife, although, of course, the content of his NDE was not exactly theologically orthodox, flying on a wing of a butterfly. He repeatedly describes his NDE as real, and there is even a chapter of Proof of Heaven called The Ultra Real. Now, I'll talk about another book in the popular culture. Colton Burpo's NDE is described in the book, co-written by his father, Todd Burpo, Heaven is for Real. This book has also sold millions of copies, and it was made into a motion picture that was widely distributed and viewed by millions. Okay. Colton became ill a few months shy of his 4th birthday. He was diagnosed with a burst appendix and underwent 2 surgeries. After he recovered, apparently miraculously, Colton began recollecting and reporting experiences he had while undergoing the first surgery and under anesthesia. He had visited heaven and personally met Jesus, God, and the Holy Spirit. He had met various deceased relatives, one of whom was a sister who had never been born due to a miscarriage. He saw angels and John the Baptist, and he even saw his parents in the hospital at the time of his surgery, his father and mother in different rooms praying. Okay, so these are extraordinary reports, amazing experiences, and there are many, many more, of course. I do want to, and I, for one, take these very seriously. I respect them as sincere, by and large, very sincere and interesting. And there are patterns throughout history and across cultures and within the same culture, patterns of similarities in these experiences that have to be taken seriously. I do, though, want to read a footnote in which I talk about one that's not sincere. So I say, I believe it's important to respect the sincerity of the majority of NDE reports. That's important for me. But I also think we have to call out the dishonest ones. For a particularly sad account of such a report, and then I give the website, but here I'm reading from this article on a website. Alex Malarkey, the American boy who disavowed his best-selling account of meeting Jesus after an accident, has launched a lawsuit against the book's Christian specialist publisher. While the publisher has, quote, made millions of dollars, end quote, the suit alleges it has paid Alex, a paralyzed young man, nothing. The car accident that almost killed Malarkey happened in 2004 in Ohio when he was 6 years old. 2 months later, he woke up from a coma to find himself paralyzed from the neck down. He and his father, Kevin, a Christian therapist, wrote The Boy Who Came Back from Heaven together. According to Chicago's Tyndale House, the firm that brought the book out in 2010, Malarkey wrote of, quote, the angels that took him through the gates of heaven itself, of the unearthly music that sounded just terrible to a 6-year-old, and most amazing of all, of meeting and talking to Jesus. But when he was 16, Malarkey revealed on his blog that he had made it all up. Quote, I did not die, I did not go to heaven, he said. When I made the claims, I had never read the Bible. People have profited from lies and continue to. They should read the Bible, which is enough. Tyndale House pulled the book, which had already sold a reported 1 million copies, saying in a statement that it was, quote, saddened to learn Alex is now saying that he made up the story of dying and going to heaven. Malarkey, who is now 20, filed a lawsuit against the publisher earlier this week, this was a while ago, claiming his father, quote, concocted a story that during the time Alex was in a coma, he had gone to heaven, communicated with God the Father, Jesus, angels, and the devil, and then returned. And alleging that while Tyndale House has made millions of dollars, they paid the paralyzed young man nothing. The article goes on to point out that Alex and his mother, who supports him, are on the verge of homelessness. So I refer, if you're interested, I have some other references. So that's a sad story. And, well, in any human phenomenon, there are going to be exaggerations, there's going to be insincerity. But I assume the vast majority of the reports are sincere. So, extraordinary and awe-inspiring experiences. There are many NDEs whose contents can independently be checked, such as those reporting conversations among surgeons and nurses. Consider, for example, the famous story of Pam Reynolds. She underwent surgery for a brain aneurysm. She was under anesthesia, blood was drained from her brain, and her body temperature was reduced to 60 degrees. The EEG, electroencephalograph, registered no brain activity sufficient for consciousness, okay, not enough to support consciousness, and yet Pam reported specific conversations of the medical team as she was being prepped for surgery. For example, she reported that the medical team discussed the problems posed by her small arteries. This conversation actually did take place. She also reported having an incredible experience. After witnessing the medical personnel prepping her body, she left the operating room for someplace else, bathed in bright light, and encountered deceased relatives who communicated to her without words. There's also the remarkable story of the man with the missing dentures. Nobody, for some reason, they talk about the case but don't mention his name, but the man with the missing dentures. He watched his body from a location above it while undergoing CPR for a cardiac arrest. When the hospital staff couldn't find his dentures the next day, he reminded the nurse that they were placed in a drawer. The man was able to locate the dentures because he recalls seeing the procedures during his cardiac arrest from a position outside his body, an out-of-body experience, or an OBE. Many have contended that NDEs can only be interpreted and explained via an invocation of supernaturalism. Supernaturalism about NDEs has two components. The claim that our minds are not just our brains and can exist after our brains and bodies stop functioning. And the claim that we come into contact with non-physical, typically heavenly realms in NDEs. The supernaturalist thus claims that our non-material minds or souls perceive or grasp features of a realm that is separate from our physical world. The first claim is dualism about the relationship between the mind and the body, so they're dualists. It is plausible that the second claim, that we are in contact with the heavenly realm in NDEs, requires the first, that our minds are non-physical. The two views typically come as a package in evaluating NDEs. Though you could, in general, you could be a dualist about the mind, i.e. you could believe the mind isn't the brain, or isn't just the brain, and not believe that there's a heaven. I think David Chalmers, the contemporary philosopher of mind, is, as he describes himself, a dualist about the mind, but he doesn't believe in an afterlife. The dominant view in the popular literature is supernaturalism. NDEs provide, quote, a proof of heaven, and they show that, quote, heaven is for real. This is also a very influential view in the more academic discussions of NDEs, which tend to attract those antecedently inclined towards supernaturalism, or maybe antecedently predisposed to take them at least seriously. In fact, most academics kind of dismiss them. And I've talked to people in medical schools who do research, and they say it's been very hard for their colleagues to get their colleagues to take them seriously. So here are just a few examples in the popular and academic literatures. First, we have already seen that the two most widely read and influential popular discussions of NDEs in recent years are entitled Proof of Heaven and Heaven is for Real. The sequel to Alexander's Proof of Heaven is called Map of Heaven. The titles indicate clearly the supernaturalism of these books. Jeffrey Long, MD, so all these people are MDs for some reason, but often they also have an advanced degree in neuroscience. Jeffrey Long, MD, who's an oncologist, and with Paul Perry, entitled their book about NDEs, Evidence of the Afterlife, the Science of Near-Death Experiences. Pim Van Lommel's book is called The Significance of Near-Death Experiences, Consciousness Beyond Life. The very active contemporary website run by the famous researcher who coined the term near-death experiences, Dr. Raymond Moody, is called the University of Heaven. So he's got, Raymond Moody coined the term. In 1975, he wrote a book called Life After Life. And he coined the term near-death experience. He's still around, and he has a blog called the University of Heaven. Okay. So in other words, what I'm trying to indicate is almost all the books are give supernatural interpretations of near-death experiences. The magic, the wisdom, the lessons of NDEs are almost universally taken to require supernaturalism. I hold that NDEs are authentic. They certainly take place, and they can be presumed to have the experiential features reported by NDEers. This is important. NDEs are real in that they really occur. But whereas NDEs really occur, there is a separate question as to whether their reported contents represent reality accurately when they are interpreted literally. NDEs may not be real in this sense, the sense of accuracy in representing the external world. NDEs are real in sense A, they really happened, but not necessarily in sense B, they represent the outside world accurately. I say not necessarily. We haven't shown that they're not accurate. We can employ the analogy of dreams here. Dreams really occur. they are indisputably authentic in this sense. But there is a separate question as to whether their contents typically, or in a particular case, represent external reality accurately. They don't when their contents are interpreted literally. As with dreams, so with NDEs. All I wish to do here is to emphasize that the two questions, authenticity and accuracy, are separate. Sliding from an answer to one to an answer to the other is a dangerous slide. Moving from sense A reality to sense B reality is a spurious transition. Elsewhere, my co-author Ben Mitchell-Yellen and I have contended that evidence of various kinds does not provide good reason to accept supernaturalism. That's in that book I refer to on the handout. We have rejected arguments for supernaturalism from the timing of the experiences, when people say the brain was offline when they had the experiences. Therefore, it can't be the brain that's supporting consciousness. It has to be some soul that's not identical to the brain. The vivid nature of the experiences, the facts that the blind and also children have NDEs. The blind have NDEs with visual content, and deaf people have NDEs with auditory phenomenal content. Children have NDEs. The universality over time and across cultures of the central features of NDEs, the putative or apparent simplicity of supernatural explanations, the awesome, beautiful, and transformative characteristics of NDEs, and so forth. All of these considerations some people take to establish that heaven is for real or that supernaturalism is true. In our book, Near-Death Experiences, Understanding the Visions of the Afterlife, we go through these one by one, and we argue that they don't really provide strong reason to accept supernaturalism. So I'm not going to really go into that here. Here I'm going to propose a novel interpretation of near-death experiences. On this view, supernaturalism is not required to interpret and understand them, and yet we can preserve their awesome characteristics. On this new interpretation, they are not just authentic, but in an important sense, accurate. So they're real in both senses. This is because, properly understood, near-death experiences are not primarily or only about the afterlife. Okay, so before I get to the new interpretation, I want to talk a little bit about why all of these people who write and who develop supernaturalist analyses of NDEs, why do so many of these reject physicalism and accept that the that the mind and consciousness doesn't stem from the brain or solely from the brain? Okay, some interpreters of NDEs employ the following pattern of reasoning, and I see it almost in every one of their treatments of NDEs. They go through many of the proposed physical explanations of NDEs, one at a time, and they point out that none of these individually explains all of the phenomena, if they explain any. Eben Alexander employs this pattern of argument in Appendix B of his book, Proof of Heaven, writing, and I quote, "I have entertained several neuroscientific hypotheses that might explain my memories. Cutting right to the chase, they all fail to explain the rich, robust, intricate interactivity of the gateway and core experiences, the ultra-reality." Alexander goes on to consider such hypotheses that put forward an individual putative explanatory factor, an individual physical explanatory factor, and he dismisses them as inadequate fully to explain his NDE and NDEs in general. Pim van Lommel's treatment of these issues is more comprehensive, detailed, and nuanced, not surprisingly, because Alexander's book is for a general audience. He considers various candidate explanations of NDEs. The physiological theories, so oxygen deficiency, carbon dioxide overload, chemical reactions in the brain, so higher levels of ketamine. So ketamine is much in the news now because they've tweaked the molecule and they're now trying to use it for depression. And Johnson & Johnson's subsidiary company, Janssen Pharmaceuticals, has this product, a nasal spray, that's a tweaked version of ketamine, which is for intractable serious depression. Intractable in the sense that the individual's tried at least 2 antidepressants and they haven't worked, so ketamine. And so it's a naturally occurring psychedelic. It naturally occurs, but in near-death experiences, it's found in higher levels. So some people have suggested that. And I just read today that the boys in Thailand who were trapped in that cave were given ketamine as part of the whole recovery process. That calmed them down. They may have had a few hallucinations, but it did calm them down. And that's the so-called the club drug Special K, ketamine. Though in its tweaked version, I call it not so Special K. Okay. Endorphins, DMT. DMT is a hallucinogen. It's the substance that's in, I think it's in psilocybin. But it's in one of, or it could be the ayahuasca. Ayahuasca, it's in ayahuasca, okay? It's just this psychedelic substance. So people are looking into all of this, or different electrical activity of the brain, and certain psychological theories, fear of death, dissociation, various kinds of fantasies, and so forth. Van Lommel argues that none of them individually explains all the phenomena associated with NDEs. Some don't explain any of them very well. He does think that more research should be done on DMT. And actually, I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. He takes a trip, or a number of spiritual voyages using psychedelic ways of producing the experiences, and he tries, what is it, ayahuasca, which is the DMT. In the end, Van Lommel is skeptical about the possibility of any adequate full explanation of NDEs within the standard scientific paradigm. Sam Parnia, another MD, offers a sophisticated discussion of the purported explanation of NDEs within the scientific paradigm. He considers oxygen deficiency, carbon dioxide overload, and various chemical changes in the brain, among other hypotheses, including activation of the NMDA receptors. I think that's dopamine receptors, which, by the way, now the new generation under development of antidepressants focus on the NMDA receptors. So, they have looked at, various other neurotransmitters like serotonin and norepinephrine and so forth, but now they're looking at dopamine and the NMDA receptors. As with Alexander and Van Lommel, he concludes that current scientific explanations are inadequate. Parnia does not turn away from science, but suggests, as with Van Lommel, that our current scientific framework may be inadequate to explain the very real phenomena of NDEs. So Parnia says, if the mind, consciousness or soul, can continue to exist and function when the brain does not function after death, then it raises the possibility that it may be a separate, undiscovered scientific entity that is not produced through the brain's usual electrical or chemical processes as we understand them based on today's understanding of neuroscience. If further confirmed, this calls for a new paradigm in neuroscience to address the issue. So Parnia is just saying we can't explain, or at least it looks like we can't explain all the phenomena of NDEs within the usual scientific paradigm, identifying the brain as the seat of consciousness. But he's not going so far as to accept dualism, but he's saying we need a new paradigm. So another more recent discussion of these issues follows a similar pattern, although she does believe in dualism. It's Peg Sartori. She considers a broad range of proposed explanations. Again, too little oxygen, too much CO2, certain drugs, endorphins, and so forth. She writes, "It is apparent that the materialist theories cannot account for the full range of complexities associated with the NDE. After over 30 years of research into the phenomenon of NDEs, not one of these proposed theories provides an adequate explanation." Okay, so all of these NDE theorists canvass what they take to be the full panoply of possible physical explanations of NDEs and conclude that they are inadequate. They tend to interpret physical explanations as involving too much or too little of certain chemicals, though not all of them, as I've read, not all of them are of that sort. They find these explanations unsatisfying, either because they don't explain any features of NDEs or they don't explain all of these features. Of course, even if one such factor does not explain any or all aspects of NDEs, it might be that a combination of them, acting additively or synergistically, may provide the requisite explanations. And the fact that we don't yet have an adequate physical explanation in terms of biochemistry, of course, does not entail that there are no prospects for such an explanation in the future. Neuroscience is still in its infancy. Maybe now it's in its toddler stage, but it's still young. And science marches on, not too concerned with incompleteness in the theories of the present moment. An analogy: we do not have a cure for pancreatic cancer. Unfortunately and sadly, a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer is essentially a death sentence currently. There is a small percentage have a certain version of pancreatic cancer that can be treated and perhaps cured, at least put in remission. Steve Jobs actually had that form of pancreatic cancer, but he didn't realize it. And so he went to Europe and sought alternative therapies. And he did die of pancreatic cancer, though he probably could have been cured. That's in the book, Steve Jobs, his biography. We have studied cancer and this particular kind of cancer for decades, and we don't yet have a cure. Does it follow that we will never have a cure? That we are going in the wrong direction by proceeding within the framework of science and medicine? Should we abandon physicalism in light of our current inability to cure the dominant form of pancreatic cancer? Obviously not. Similarly, we don't yet have a theory of everything in physics, unifying our best theories of the behavior of macroscopic and microscopic phenomena. Also, we don't have a fully adequate and undisputed account of the fundamental constituents of reality. Do these facts about the current state of physics imply or even suggest that we should give up on science? It would be a glaring non sequitur to make this leap, okay? A non sequitur of numbing grossness, as someone said, about a different non sequitur, though it's one of my favorite phrases. Unfortunately, many NDE theorists make precisely this leap into murky waters. Consider this passage from Sartori's book. Neurological processes have been suggested to be the cause of the NDE, and there are several theories describing these processes in detail. Most of these theories have been proposed from the premise that the brain creates consciousness. However, it remains unclear how conscious experiences can arise from neurological structures and accompany the neurological processing. Sartori goes on to reject the popular, quote, popular materialist belief, end quote, that the neurological processes cause consciousness. Rather, she suggests that it is more plausible to suppose that the brain mediates consciousness. Exactly what that is not clear. Some of these people think the brain is like a receiver that receives the waves or the stuff that's out there that is the consciousness. And that's a view that goes back to the philosopher Henri Bergson, though they don't know that, or they don't say that. It's certainly not obvious how, if at all, consciousness emerges from the material constituents and processes of the brain. It can seem mysterious how this is even possible. On the other hand, it seems at least equally, if not more mysterious, how consciousness could emerge from a non-physical entity, such as a soul. How could something non-physical, non-material, feel like something or underwrite subjective awareness? Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, contemporary philosopher, talked about this in his paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And he said there are these problems with the what it's like properties or the qualitative subjective states of our minds. How can they be physical? But equally mysterious is how the soul could have what it's like properties, something totally non-physical. It doesn't seem to help to invoke dualism. Okay. So, naturalism and supernaturalism have their challenges, but at least the project of explaining the mind in terms of neurological structures and processes is situated within the framework of science with well understood and widely accepted assumptions and methods. There are big gaps in our scientific knowledge, but history shows that science makes progress, sometimes dramatic progress. The assumptions and methods of dualism, which posits a non-physical mind, are obscure. To seek to explain the mind by invoking a soul or non-physical entities and processes is to offer an explanation obscurum per obscurius. All right. So basically what I want to do, I'm going a little longer than I want, so I want to make sure I don't go too long, but I want to suggest a different direction for a physical explanation, that we don't use just, let's say, the idea of too much carbon dioxide, not enough oxygen, more DMT than is usual, or more ketamine. So, in other words, we're not going to look so much for an excess or deficiency of a certain substance or chemical, but we're going to look at certain functional processes. And I'm not the first one to offer it. Michael Pollan suggests this in passing in his book, How to Change Your Mind. An NDE is a spiritual experience that is similar to various other such experiences in that it is caused by a certain system or module of the brain being taken offline or not functioning in the normal way. As Michael Pollan puts it, the mystical experience may just be what it feels like when you deactivate the brain's default mode network. This can be achieved any number of ways, through psychedelics and meditation, but perhaps also by means of certain breathing exercises like holotropic breath work, sensory deprivation, fasting, prayer, overwhelming experiences of awe, extreme sports, near-death experiences, and so on. What would scans of brains in the midst of these spiritual activities or spiritual experiences reveal? We can only speculate, but quite possibly we would see the same quieting of the default network, of the default mode network. It's a network in the brain. This quieting might be accomplished by restricting blood flow to the network or various other ways. But however it happens, taking this particular network offline may give us access to extraordinary states of consciousness, moments of oneness or ecstasy that are no less wondrous for having a physical cause. Okay, now that's the end of the quote from Pollan. What is the default mode network, the DMN? It's the network in the brain that exhibits heightened activity when we seem to be doing nothing, when our minds do not have a specific task to perform. Our minds are wandering, you might say. Again, Michael Pollan writes, the default mode network is the place where our minds go to wander, to daydream, ruminate, travel in time, reflect on ourselves, and worry. So there's an interesting book I've been reading by Robert Wright, a journalist, basically. It's called Why Buddhism is True. And that's the book. And so here's a quote. I was beginning to observe the workings of what psychologists call the default mode network. This is a network in the brain that, according to brain scan studies, is active when we're doing nothing in particular. Not talking to people, not focusing on our work or any task, not playing a sport or reading a book or watching a movie. It is the network along which our mind wanders when Along with, yeah, when our brains are wandering, this is the network that underwrites that. Robin Wright points out that in meditation, we seek to quiet the mind. So Buddhist meditation, we seek to quiet the mind and reduce, if not eliminate, the wanderings. I don't know if you've tried meditation, but the problem is to stop your brain from wandering. You know, the wild animal keeps escaping. We thus take the default mode network offline in meditation. And there's Hindu, in the Bhagavad Gita, there's a discussion of the three qualities or states of consciousness: dark inertia, which I love, passion, and lucidity. So dark inertia or heedlessness is that state when our minds are wandering, we're not doing anything in particular. And through yoga, I mean, in Buddhism, it's through meditation. In Hinduism, roughly, I'm over generalizing and simplifying. It's through yoga, which is a kind of meditation as well, that you go from dark inertia and heedlessness to illumination. But it's kind of like what's going on with all of these experiences, that you're going from a kind of dull heedlessness, a dark inertia, to some more enlightened state. I'm skipping a little. One of the most salient features of a spiritual or mystical experience, including meditation, prayer, and NDEs, is the loss of a sense of self as separate and apart from the rest of reality. It is plausible that this comes from the reduced functioning of the default mode network. NDEs share some of the most important characteristics of other spiritual experiences. According to Pollan, these shared traits include a vision of unity in which all things, including the self, are subsumed, expressed in the phrase, all is one, a sense of certainty about what one has perceived, feelings of joy, blessedness, and satisfaction, a transcendence of the categories we rely on to organize the world, such as time and space or self and other. Okay, don't tell Kant about this, that we can transcend those. A sense that whatever has been apprehended is somehow sacred. Last is the conviction that the experience is ineffable, even as thousands of words are expended in the attempt to communicate its power. Okay, that's the end of the quote. The view I am suggesting for further consideration is that NDEs are also like other spiritual experiences in that they are a product of lessened activity of the default mode network. This is a physicalist, a neurophysiological explanation, a naturalist one, but not one that has been discussed or explored in any detail. It was mentioned by Pollan. This literature, the standard NDE literature, points to various other kinds of explanations, but they typically involve deficits or excessive amounts of certain chemicals, but that's unduly restricted. So we can have a physical explanation that's not so narrow. Okay, so now it's the end of the final part, a new interpretation that I promised you. Okay, so the standard interpretation is supernatural. NDEs are taken to provide strong evidence for, and usually the point is put more strongly in terms of proof of the afterlife. As I noted above, this is the second component of supernaturalism, and we need to look no further than the titles of the most visible books, contemporary books, to see this interpreted. Like I read you the titles. They're all about the afterlife or heaven. And I could read you some more, but it's redundant. So above, I distinguished two notions of real in the claim that NDEs are real. One idea here of reality is that people really do have NDEs with the content they describe. This is indisputably true for the great majority of NDE reports, leaving Alex Malarkey aside. I love that name, it's perfect. People really have NDEs, just as people really dream. But there's another notion of reality according to which NDEs are accurate representations of an external reality. That NDEs are real in the first sense does not entail that they are real in the second. even though in the literature there's often kind of a slide between the one and the others. NDEs are real, therefore heaven is for real, but that's a slide, a logical slide. All right. So I think it would be desirable to give a charitable interpretation of the contents of NDEs and the reports of NDEers. So on my approach, we could understand NDEs as real in both senses of reality. People really have the experiences, and on my interpretation, they would be true or accurate in representing the external world. Here's my idea. We interpret NDEs as being primarily about the last phase of our lives, dying, rather than about the afterlife. So when we use the term death, it usually, sometimes we mean dying, our deaths, that process, that last part of the life. Sometimes we mean the status of being dead, but sometimes we mean dying. So that's what I'm suggesting. Although in some NDEs, the explicit content includes contact with the heavenly realm or hellish realms. There are about 10% of the reports are negative. Okay. And we can talk about those. Those are in some ways more interesting. But most don't actually talk about the content with the heavenly realms. Rather, they are stories of journeys toward a gated or demarcated place, or domain or status, like heaven as a gated community. A travel toward this gated community guided by deceased loved ones or beloved religious figures. The most important feature of these stories, in my view, is that they are journeys guided by loving mentors or trusted companions. So at the risk of being trite, the content of NDEs is best understood as a guided journey without any articulation of a specific destination. Okay, I said it in a fancy way. The point is, it's the journey, not the destination, that counts. That's the trite. After all, NDEers often report that as they approach a river or gate or a bright light at the end of a tunnel, they awaken or regain waking consciousness. This abrupt truncation of the NDE is typically disappointing. It's only a minority, certainly not all NDEs, which describe a destination of an otherworldly realm which is reached. Of course, people make movies out of those, but most of them don't actually talk about going through the gate or crossing the river. So we can then interpret NDEs as being about the last phase of our life's journey, dying. Positive NDEs contend or point to the fact that dying can indeed be good or even sublime. Negative NDEs point to the fact that dying can be terrible. On the positive side, we can die surrounded by loving relatives and friends in a humane and supportive environment. We can die peacefully, perhaps with hopes of a continued journey on the other side. On the negative side, we can die alone, suffering terribly, or treated with so much pain medication that we are not able to be clear and lucid or at peace. We die as listless zombies. We can die, and increasingly in the modern world of advancing medical technology, in sterile institutional environments. There's a lot of interesting discussion now. Maybe you've read Atul Gawande's book on being mortal, or Sherwin Newland's book, How We Die, and other MDs who are taking a look at our practices of keeping people alive in hospitals for extended period of time in sterile contexts, and they're wondering whether this is really what we should want. Okay, so interpreted, NDEs are real in the sense that they are accurate portrayals of the possibilities, both attractive and repellent, of dying. Possibilities that are really present in our world. In some NDEs, there is indeed a portrayal of an afterlife in an otherworldly domain, frequently containing divine or satanic beings. But these are a minority, and in any case, they also contain detailed descriptions of benevolently guided journeys toward these realms. In many cases, the NDEer does not cross the barriers. In some cases, they do. But we can interpret them as fundamentally or primarily about the journey and not the destination. We can understand them as primarily about the last phase of life. So interpreted, they are real. In Eben Alexander's memorable term, ultra-real. And so interpreted, we can see that there are no logical gaps or mistakes in construing their contents as accurate. Okay, I think there are logical mistakes and gaps going from the evidence, the reported experiences, to the claim that supernaturalism obtains. There are gaps there, significant gaps. But there aren't, I don't think, in arguing that the experiences point to or indicate or reveal possibilities for dying, good or bad. The negative ones, the 10% of the negative ones are the bad ones. So, on this interpretation, NDEs can be part of a two-pronged naturalist strategy for reducing but not eliminating death anxiety. So it's a kind of terror management strategy. There's a famous theory propounded originally by Ernest Becker, in his book, The Denial of Death, to the effect that just about everything we do is based on managing our terror of death. And so it's something that would be good to have some kind of naturalistic terror management strategy. The first step is to recognize that dying need not be sterile or painful, and it can even be beautiful. There's a whole movement of kind of more green burials and alternative funeral practices where sometimes the body is at home. It's kind of like home births or natural births, and birth and death being bookends. There's this whole movement now for more natural funerary or memorial practices. Death doesn't have to be sterile in an institution or painful, and it can even be ecstatic and beautiful. Matter of fact, many people report right at the end a kind of ecstasy. So we should not fear dying. We need not fear dying. Now, of course, it can involve pain, but we do have good pain management techniques. So we shouldn't at least fear it too much, let me put it that way. And the second prong is to keep in mind what Epicurus emphasized: we will not be there to suffer after we have died. So dying itself need not be something we fear. And then the status of being dead need not be something we fear, because we're not going to be there at all. We will not be there to suffer. Okay. These points give us some reason not to dread death. Maybe if you get anything from this lecture, you could think about, hey, maybe I could incorporate this into my own attitudes about death. I mean, dying doesn't have to be bad, and the status of being dead won't involve any suffering. But still, we won't be there when we are dead, and this itself can be frightening. So in other words, yeah, it offers some consolation or some comfort, but it can be scary to think that you won't be there at all. And I don't know what I think about that. I mean, I'm not sure whether it should be frightening. Should it be frightening that we won't be there? Because we won't be suffering at all. I took a walk with a couple of students, Nathan and Daniel, and Nathan said, yeah, lights out. So that's the idea, lights out. When you're dead, you're not there, lights are out. How could it really be something you should fear? Now, maybe it's a bad thing, okay. Maybe it's a bad thing that you die prematurely. But being bad is different from something that's rational to fear. And it's really not, I can't really decide one way or the other, but it doesn't seem right to say you fear a situation in which the lights are out and you're not there at all. So anyway, that offers a little bit of progress. And even if we can't totally eliminate death anxiety, maybe we can reduce it a little bit. And maybe the correct attitude is a kind of ambivalence, or holding in your mind two thoughts that aren't really compatible but seem equally kind of real. that death is something that shouldn't be feared, but then it might be scary as well. So, okay. So really, I promise you, just 3 more paragraphs. Almost everyone interprets NDEs as being about the afterlife, giving the NDEers a glimpse of an otherworldly realm and showing that heaven is for real. So understood, there are glaring logical difficulties. The NDE evidence, together with plausible ancillary principles, don't even come close to establishing either of supernaturalism's 2 central components: dualism about the mind and the real existence of a domain outside our physical space. At least that's my view, respectfully. They don't establish supernaturalism. But it would be unfortunate if so many sincere, thoughtful people were hopelessly wrong. This is not a charitable interpretation. Better, or at least nicer, to find an interpretation according to which they are largely right. I have given such an interpretation, a naturalistic interpretation on which NDEs are real. NDEs really have experiences and their contents are true. I might end by suggesting that we can add an element to this naturalistic interpretation. We can stick with the interpretation I've sketched, according to which the primary content is about possibilities for dying. But we can add in that they often offer at least the hope of a desirable afterlife. Again, this would not undermine their veracity. It's not unreasonable to hope, especially as our world is, or at least can be, a vale of tears. Many human beings throughout history have yearned for an afterlife in which eternal peace is attained and justice is victorious. Near-death experiences offer this hope. And before I end, I wanted to read you just a short passage from Job, from the book of Job, and it's the speech that God gives from the whirlwind. You know, Job is complaining, have all these afflictions and plagues. What did I do to deserve this? God, what's up? And God replies from the world, or an unnamed individual replies from the whirlwind. This is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful passage. Have you ever commanded morning? He's talking to Job. He's saying, basically, who are you to question this? Have you ever commanded morning or guided dawn to its place, to hold the corners of the sky and shake off the last few stars? All things are touched with color. The whole world is changed. Have you walked through the depths of the ocean or dived to the floor of the sea? Have you stood at the gates of doom or looked through the gates of death? Have you seen to the edge of the universe? Speak up if you have such knowledge. The idea being, a near-death experience is like being at the edge of the universe. It's like peering through the gates of death. And maybe one of the reasons they're so awesome is that it's like we're given this godlike power. Maybe we can't go through the gate, but we can peer through and then return. Okay, maybe I'll stop there. Okay. Okay, thank you. How should I can get? Oh, you want to answer, or do you want? I mean, do you answer? Do you want to? Do you want to take the question? I can do it. I think I can do it. All right. So anybody? All right, in the back. Yes. Yes, the young woman. Yes. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Okay. There are, how to put this, I'm not sure I fully heard the question, but a lot of people who have the near-death experiences are religious, but not all of them are. And a lot of people who have them and make some sort of supernatural conclusion they are either antecedently religious or they might be skeptical, but maybe they are open to religion. So Eben Alexander, the neurosurgeon, said that he grew up in a religious family, but it never kind of took for him. He was always skeptical. But what's interesting is in his book, he talks about yearning. He wishes that he could accept the Christian religion in which he grew up. So that would be, it's interesting because then he has his experience and his wish comes true. There are, of course, atheists who have near-death experiences, and I think some of them do convert to some sort of religion and others don't. And there's a famous atheist philosopher, A.J. Ayer, who did have a near-death experience, and it presented an afterlife. And I guess afterwards he said he still doesn't believe in the afterlife, but he's not so sure. Okay? Yeah, I think, well, what I have noted, there are some people who, so one reason why Eben Alexander's book has been influential, people are interested in it, is he presents himself as a skeptic and a scientist, as rigorous. And so even he had this experience. But there are many books written by people who are Christian, let's say, antecedently. And so it's, I don't know if you want to take those quite as seriously, but maybe you do. But they are, there's a woman named Mary Neal who has had a number of near-death experiences. She is a Christian. She believed even before that she could communicate with Jesus and so forth. And so the fact that she believes she went to heaven and back and learned lessons from heaven, I don't know how much credence you want to give it, but she was a neuroscientist as well. Okay. Oh, okay, lots of questions. Let me try and get students first, though. Okay, yes.
So this is kind of like a multi-part question.
Okay.
I was wondering if you think it is possible that we possess different states of consciousness or states of mind that are nested within our awareness, and we are not always directly aware of these states of consciousness, but they are ever present and they arise through near-death experiences and other experiences, and it allows the individual experiencer to become aware of that sort of greater super-individual presence, which they can then take back into their individual life every day.
Okay, wait, before we go on. Let's see, were you asking, could someone have a number of states of consciousness that they're not necessarily aware of?
Yeah, they're not ever present because say that we have like an individualized sense of consciousness, but then there's sort of a subtle sense of consciousness, and well, it's like a supra sense of consciousness that's beyond the individuality, and that these near-death experiences sort of bring people into that greater awareness of consciousness.
Right.
They are allowed to perceive, unity within the world.
You tap into something that's we might call subconscious. See, I don't know whether I'd call that consciousness so consciousness or conscious states usually mean states that you are aware of. And then subconscious or unconscious states are maybe real, but you're not aware of them. You don't have experiential access to them. So I definitely think that you can have states of your mind that you're not aware of, or they're subconscious or they're unconscious. I believe that's right. And maybe near-death experiences kind of tap into those and bring them out. I agree, that's possible. Now, of course, we haven't gotten to supernaturalism, but yeah, okay.
And then furthermore, I was wondering if the concept of dualism sort of arises from the maybe not
Thank you.
present awareness of a unified background matrix. And for example, this I will call landscape ecology. So in landscape ecology, we delineate changes in landscape based on the relationship to a unified matrix patch.
To a unified what?
Unified matrix patch. So you would have a willow tree and an aspen tree, and those are the, let's say, the individual consciousness. But then you have the plant biochemical interactions going on within the soil, which you cannot see.
Right.
Which can just be like the unconsciousness.
I
And
see.
then you have the soil matrix itself, which builds up that entire thing, which could be a reference to that super individual cosmic consciousness.
Yes. Well, from what I understand, and Michael Pollan in his book, How to Change Your Mind, has an extended discussion of the research that seems to show that trees communicate in a certain way. They communicate in this way, and you call it a kind of consciousness. It's a little different. I don't know if it's experiential, or if there's something it's like. I doubt it. There's something it's like to be a tree. There's something that's like to be you, and something like to be me. Something that's like to be a dog. So, according to Thomas Nagel, there's something that's like to be a bat. We don't have access to that. We don't have access to the trees' interstates, but I doubt that they have interstates. But they do in some way communicate. And it could be a kind of awareness. If you think of awareness, there's a kind of awareness that's a sensing of a cue or some perturbation in our environment. And that perturbation registers on us, even if we're not aware of it. So that, I mean, even if we're not consciously aware. So I agree, there can be all that. And maybe near-death experiences tap into the subconscious or unconscious states. And maybe these other, like prayer and meditation and the use of psychedelic substances, maybe there are different ways of tapping in. Yeah, that's possible. But it doesn't get you to supernaturalism, but it's just a more nuanced way of describing us. Good, thank you. And by the way, LSD, Oliver Sacks in his book, Hallucinations, talks about a young man reported an experience on an LSD trip. And it's just like a near-death experience. Just like. It's a fascinating, I commend this report to you. And by the way, I just want to say, we call these experiences trips, right? So they're voyages, in my view. Okay, yes, is it Brandon?
Yes. So since we'll all have a death experience, and this has been your focus of study for so many years, not to be morbid, but when your death experience comes, have you planned some questions you're going to ask yourself while you're having this experience? And are you going to try to answer questions, or are you just going to enjoy the journey?
No, the question will be, can I have some more morphine? No, I don't. No, I haven't thought of that. You remember, I'm the director of the Immortality Project, and so I want to be immortal. No, what I have begun to do, because believe it or not, I'm probably not young anymore, I've begun to think about, and some of my friends have died, I've begun to think about it. I guess I was kind of somewhat neurotically preoccupied anyway for all my life. But I used to think, this is going to be terrible. I'm going to be in horrible pain. And maybe I could be given pain medication, but then I won't be really clear and lucid. But now I'm coming to realize that there are ways of controlling pain compatibly with still being lucid, at least much of the time. And you can die surrounded by loved ones and companions, and you can have a chance to reflect on your life as a whole and bring it together and achieve a kind of peace. And there are these interesting projects. By the way, has anyone seen a recent documentary called Endgame? Endgame. Oh, I highly recommend it. It's maybe it's HBO or Netflix or one of those. And it talks about the Zen hospice project associated with UC San Francisco Medical School, their end-of-life and palliative care department. And they have this house that is called the Zen hospice, and people go and they die there, but it's a house, and they have all sorts of meditation and prayer, and they have people come and give massages, and they're very loving, and it's a very humane way of dying. So I don't think we have to die in some hospital room on a respirator where our family visits us for a while, but after the months they don't anymore. And so I'm having a different view about dying. And then I also, I think, well, is it really right to fear a state when I don't exist at all? I agree that premature death can be a bad thing. I believe that. It can block our projects, it can thwart it can prevent us from pursuing things we care about, and it can deprive us of experiences that we otherwise would have had. So it's a bad thing. But should I fear it? I don't think so. So I'm changing my attitude. I hope that I'll be more at peace. I don't know that I've thought about questions to ask. What I'd like to somehow work up to the last minutes by being at peace and figuring things out, or figuring out my life, or making sense of it, not necessarily thinking that it all fits together in a cohesive way. Anyway, I've changed my attitude and my way of picturing that period in my life, and I want to continue to do that. Anyway, thank you for the question. Okay, yes, in the back.
One of the things I like about your suggestion the most is that it creates a kind of unity with certain other thankfully unusual states. Meaning between the two forms of psychotic states. In manic psychosis, there very, very often is this sense of unification that you're describing for the near-death experience. In schizophrenic psychosis, there is almost universally some sort of religious content that's recruited into the psychotic story. And to think of that as a part of the journey of what it is like to be psychotic, I think could be quite helpful, because one of the things you deal with, I'm a psychiatrist, one of the things you deal with in people who are getting better from, say, medication for their psychotic state, is their, in the case of mania, their reluctance to give up the idea that they understood everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I know you may not get it, Dr. Johnson. You're trying, I appreciate that. But it may be a little beyond you.
Yeah.
But I was there, and I knew.
Yeah.
And to get them down from that super confident or narcissistic-like
Mm-hmm.
interpretation can require a lot of patience. And I think having your view of that being part of the journey of psychosis could be quite helpful.
Well, thank you. I'll have to think about that more. I hadn't made that connection. It's definitely in a near-death experience, the individual is seeing or having the experience as if she or he is seeing deceased loved ones, communicating with them, religious figures, and they present themselves as real, as lucid, and so in that way it's similar to a psychotic who's seeing things, as it were. But it would be interesting. Now, of course, I don't want to leave it there, and I appreciate your suggestion. It's not as though everyone who's had a near-death experience is having a psychotic episode. It's a certain episode that's similar to psychosis, but very different as well. So anyway, thank you. I'll think about it more. Yes?
A two-part question. I'm not a philosopher, so I'm a little confused about terminology, perhaps. Do you make a distinction between non-materialism and supernaturalism?
Well, they're very closely related. I'd say non-materialism is a denial that the world as we know it is just physical. What they'll say is, the world as we know it includes our mind and our mental states, and a materialist would say those are just states of the brain, and all there is physical stuff. A non-materialist might say, no, the mind is at least partly immaterial. It's a soul, or there are non-physical properties of the brain. But that falls short of supernaturalism in the sense that you might still not believe in an afterlife. It's just the denial of materialism. So that view doesn't necessarily imply that there is an afterlife.
The reason I ask is, I realize the NDEs, there's a lot of ambiguities you pointed out.
Right.
But I've read the work of Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, who have documented hundreds and hundreds of cases of children who seem to remember past lives.
Right.
Very, very meticulously eliminating most possible explanations, other explanations.
Right.
And so that they critique a purely materialist view of
Right.
this without necessarily being spiritualist
Right.
Do you accept their work as pause for thought?
I accept
about
their
this?
work as serious and thoughtful. They are, it was interesting, they were at the University of Virginia, at the
Right.
same place that Bruce Grayson is, who's now still writing about NDEs, and they have a whole interest in paranormal phenomena there. And Stevenson and Tucker, they're, yeah, rigorous, thoughtful work. But I myself don't accept their conclusions. I mean, I agree that you should look at these cases carefully, but in our book, you can get it at the library, or you could buy it used, so I'm not trying to sell my book. But in the book that I wrote about NDEs with my postdoc, Ben, we talk at length about that, the James Leininger case that they talk about, the past life case, one of the most famous, where this young boy, he was 5 when he started talking about his past life as he held that he was a fighter pilot in a past life. And the amazing thing was he could reel off all these details of firefights and battles in war, and details that seemed only to be possible to know if you were there. But then people looked at it more carefully, and turns out that when he was 3, his parents took him to an air museum, and there was a display, and they read to him the display out loud with many of these details. And then when they went home, presumably they talked about it, and he was a very smart 3-year-old, and a smart 3-year-old can pick up stuff, and then maybe later, though he couldn't articulate that, later he was able to kind of articulate some of this stuff. But it turns out when you look at the case carefully, the prior life hypothesis is not the only one. And my view, and this is just a prejudice, or at least a predisposition, let's say, an inclination, that whenever you have a story that purports to be a story of prior lives, there should be some non-prior life naturalistic explanation that you can find. But I admit that I don't have them in all the cases, and I admit that Stevenson and Tucker were meticulous and thoughtful. But I mean, I think
And they had hundreds of cases.
they had hundreds of cases, but I mean, how many thousands and maybe millions of cases of very sincere people could you find who think they've been healed by faith healers? I mean, how many? Doesn't matter. It doesn't make it true, in my view. Okay. All right. So, yes.
So the healing paradigm studies the psychostability of memories, such as the Mandela effect, where when false memory is generated in a few people, multiple others genuinely experience it. It's a contagious psychological phenomenon. Could NDEs and their widespread occurrence be explained by this, and could their brains have created these memories after the fact of the trauma? For example, if I implanted a memory in your head that you went to Las Vegas before you came here, how you wouldn't know whether you actually went to Las Vegas or if the memory is planted. So could their brains have implanted, created these memories of viewing a loved one after the fact of the trauma?
How would it work? They definitely, in my view, they definitely had these experiences, like a dream. People definitely have dreams with content. I think they had these experiences while they were not wakefully conscious. You could say they were conscious, but not wakefully conscious. And so they have memories, or quasi-memories. Well, I mean, memories as of having done these things. It's just that the memories are the apparent memories. Sometimes in philosophy we call them quasi-memories, where it seems like it happened, and that's the way it presents itself to you in the past. But they're not true. So, I mean, were you saying that it could be a kind of contagion, or I wasn't sure.
So it's probably a two-part statement is that since the
Oh, yeah, yeah, good.
Could those patients have created these memories, not created, but like, could their brains have created these memories because of trauma? And then could the widespread occurrence be explained by like psychological contagion, or you know what I mean?
I don't think it's contagion. I think it would be hard to establish that. But what you said about suggestibility is really important because people invoke the idea that children all over the world, children have NDEs where they report content that's similar, But the problem is the young kids are not telling the stories. The parents are telling the stories or adults are telling the stories. And sometimes they'll bring in psychologists. They did in the Leininger case. They'll bring in child psychologists, but the way they ask the questions is crucial. It's like any poll, how you ask the question. And kids are very suggestible, and so they pick up that their questioner wants them to believe this. Like Colton Burpo's father, Todd, was a minister. And of course, a young kid wants to please their parent. And so I agree, there's a kind of suggestibility that may well play a role in some of these reports. And it might well be, you might be right that if a number of people with whom you're familiar report this, it's maybe not contagion, but it may make it more likely that you will report it. I agree. I can't though, I think there's something even more rooted in biology than just contagion. I think it has to do, the default mode network kind of governs and constrains us in a lot of ways. And when that's taken offline, it kind of frees us up. And I think something like that is happening in spiritual experiences in general. Again, I'm not a scientist, but it's a plausible hypothesis. And maybe this is going on in near-death experiences. But let me also say, the way we conceptualize these raw experiences is, to some extent, dependent on our culture and our compatriots. So here's an example. It comes from Bruce Grayson from Virginia. In Western cultures, just about every Western culture, we have this trope. There's always light at the end of the tunnel. No matter how bad it is, no matter how scary the situation, there's always light at the end of the tunnel. So we tend to report in a near-death experience a light at the end of a tunnel, or in a black area, and we travel toward the light. But in Japan, they don't have that trope, but they have the idea that it would be comforting in old age as you approach death to purchase a plot of land and attend a rock garden with loved ones, And in Japan, in their near-death experiences, they often report that. So the idea is there are certain similarities, but also specifics are different depending on culture and suggestibility. So also the religious figures are different. In India, they're Hindu religious figures. In Western cultures, it's often Christian religious figures. So there are important differences, but at some level they are similar. There's usually an out-of-body experience. There's often a life review. There's this guidance by a mentor or a trusted loved one, maybe a family figure or a religious figure. Now, the specifics are different, but there are these similarities, which is interesting. And I think they're rooted in something. Anyway, good. Yes?
So, with a good reason for at least maybe Christian philosophers or whoever believe the supernatural aspect of it, would be enough to deny the supernatural if they come back and report something that's heretical to the faith, like reporting the concept of the Trinity that's actually false, and have to either deny 2,000 years of Christian teaching, or they'd have to say that it wasn't like
Okay, so I'm not sure I heard it, but is this the question that there would be a big incentive for a serious believer in a certain religion, let's say some version of Christianity, serious incentive for that person not to report something incompatible with the church's teachings. Is that what you were saying?
Like what if someone reports that,
Yeah,
false teaching from their experience?
yeah.
Would that be enough reason for a Christian to deny that experience?
Well, I think if someone who's a sincere Christian, let's say, comes back and he said, in my experience, I saw Jesus and Satan, and they were playing poker together, or whatever, something really horrible. If he saw that, I don't know what to say. He shouldn't report it, probably. But I think, I don't know, I think the truth behind your question is what we we have antecedent beliefs and acculturation, and they're going to shape the way we describe our experiences. They're not all there is to the experience. So, for instance, you see there's a flash of light, and maybe in Japan, nobody notices it. It's a flash of light. But maybe in our culture, we say, it's a light at the end of the tunnel. And that's because of a difference in the culture. So there's I don't know how to put it, a pressure. Now, negative NDEs, I should just mention, there about 10% of the reports are negative. But we think maybe they're underreporting, because if you come back and say, I had this experience of descending, I was being guided by Satan down, and I saw suffering, and I kept going down toward darkness and away from the light. Someone's going to think, hey, maybe you're not a very nice guy, or maybe, you've done something to deserve this, and so there's an incentive not to report that. Maybe it's like if you're, I don't know. You know how it is with pollsters. They'll ask some questions that people are uncomfortable admitting their real view, like, well, I won't give any examples, but, that's the kind of thing. So anyway, I'll just leave it. There's a famous, I would recommend to you, you could Google this. There's a famous, a Buddhist monk reported, let's see, he reported a near-death experience in which the Buddha was in hell. And it was because he didn't accept Christian teachings and Jesus. So the monk, the Buddhist monk who reported this, then converted to Christianity. But it was later debunked, the whole thing. And there's a book on this by Nancy Evans Bush. She tends to specialize in negative near-death experiences, and her book is called The Buddha in Hell. And it's very interesting. But it's one of these things like Alex Malarkey, where people report these things that aren't sincere. So there is some of that. But there's also the negative. Okay, I'm sorry. That might be too much information.
I just have a question about the negative near-death.
Yeah.
You said at the beginning that with the near-death experiences, that people that have them, when they come back and their attitudes are positive or change. So with the negative near-death, is it the same sort of change, or do they become more depressed?
Yeah, good. Very good question. And I have my own view on this. I don't know whether it's right, but I think near-death experiences are, the basic content is a journey that's guided by a trusted mentor, someone more experienced and who has your interests in mind. Put someone reductionistically, it's a fiduciary. It's someone who cares about you and your interests and you defer to. Might be a religious figure, might be a parent. That's the kind of core story, and it often leads to significant transformations. And I think negative and positive ones are similar at a certain abstract level, because the negative ones tend to be journeys. This time it's downward rather than up. It's away from the light, but it's a journey that's guided by some kind of mentor. Why is it a mentor and why is it benevolent? The individual is not, is trying to show you what could happen to you if you don't change your ways, basically. It's giving you lessons, you know. This suffering could happen to you. So in a sense, the individual is benevolent. It's tough love, you could say, but benevolent. And the transformation does sometimes occur, right? Because the person, when he or she regains wakeful consciousness, might well change as a result of this. And one of the scientists who we supported in the Immortality Project, an Israeli psychiatrist and neuroscientist named Shahar Arzi, he studied the life review. That was his thing. Like, how can this occur? I mean, it's kind of fascinating. Where is it stored in the brain? I mean, how does it occur? And one thing he did, he interviewed a number of patients, and one that stuck out in his mind said, when I had my life review, I saw that I had really badly mistreated certain people, in particular some former woman friends of his. And he said it really changed him. I mean, he was enlightened. So I think that's a model for how it could be transformative in a positive way. But I agree that the ultimate serenity that might come would be mediated by deep anxiety, because you say, unless I change, something really this bad is going to happen. It's a little, but good question. I think the negative ones are understudied. But again, it might be because they're underreported. Who wants to admit, you know, I had this negative near-death experience? Yes?
I think you mentioned the word sublime maybe once or twice in your speech. And I was wondering if any of these individuals who have experienced these experiences describe their journey in beautiful terms, or as beautiful experiences, and go back to produce beautiful things with their works of art or literature or something like that.
Good.
Is there that kind of a cycle of production between experience and the next step?
So I should emphasize again, not only am I not a scientist, but I am not a real expert at all of the research on near-death experiences. I started studying them when I got the grant, which was in 2012. So I've done a lot of reading, but not everything. So I honestly don't know if there's been a study of people who've done, like, after they've had their near-death experience, they've done beautiful art, or, you know, in that sense. What I do know is they do, I don't know if I would use the word sublime, but I don't have any problem with that, but they report it as beautiful. The realm is beautiful, it's peaceful, it's accepting. You are loved. And it's a beautiful, peaceful realm. And then the transformations are often being more pro-social, being less worried about death. But I don't know if people become more creative. It's a good question. You should get a grant and study that. I also think someone should study, because I don't know that they have, whether, like, you can identify factors that predispose you toward having a negative one. Like, are people who are chronically depressed or anxious, are they more likely to have a negative one? Are people who are in a fire and brimstone kind of religious church, are they more likely to have a negative one? Or, you know what, I don't think we know the answer to that. Yes?
I was wondering, could you talk about drugs as opposed to like DMT and stuff like that? They all have trip lengths, right? So
They all have what?
trip lengths, so the amount of duration that occurs
Of the spiritual experience, yeah.
in the spiritual experience, right? So, and those trip lengths are known, right? Traditionally, LSD lasts 12 hours. Is there, and of course, time dilation occurs within that, right? So you would feel sort of things would happen slower or faster, but
Right.
a certain amount of experiences would occur.
Yeah.
Is there any way to prove, I mean, not necessarily prove, but to sort of talk about the length of the near-death experience and try and prove that drugs weren't evolved because the drug couldn't be in the system after the trip length has occurred? So, like, if you took DMT, or if you took LSD, it would take 12 hours for it to take
But have there been prolonged near death experiences, like I was there for 12 days or I was there for a year?
Good questions, and it raises so many issues. One thing is, let me just say, these people claim, and Aben Alexander is a good example, and others, they claim because they're neuroscientists and neurosurgeons, they've been trained well enough to know that their brain was offline. Their brain, of course, still minimally functioning to support the housekeeping chores of the body, but not enough to support consciousness. They're saying the experience had to happen during that time. But one point that others have made, and I want to emphasize, is we really don't know when the NDE occurs. And we don't know that it occurs when the brain is offline. So for instance, with a dream, we know from studying the brain that it often occurs just as you're waking up, as your brain is ramping up to be conscious. And it might seem, the content presents a longer period of time. It might seem to you that you're dreaming about events that took place a while ago, but the experience itself is taking place as you're about to wake up. That might be happening in an NDE. It might be that, the brain is offline for a while, but now it's ramping up. And as it's ramping up, you have this experience. And it seems like you had it for a long time, but you didn't. That's a possibility, and these people can't rule it out. Some of the arguments are, well, they say proof of heaven. Heaven is for real. You have to accept supernaturalism based on these phenomena. Now, one, at least interesting, but minimal task that you could have is show, no, you don't have to. There's an alternative. Another more robust task would be to say, well, not only is there an alternative, but the alternative explanation is the best explanation. That's a more robust conclusion. Okay, but I just want to say we don't really know. I guess we would have, one of the problems is, let's say you could find an area of the brain that lights up when someone's having a dream and having experiences in a dream. And then you found a similar part lighting up when after someone wakes up and says, I had a near-death experience, and we could look and see that there was something. But one of the problems is most people who have near-death experiences aren't already hooked up to a machine. Or, we can't run to the accident site and hook up an fMRI or something, So that's one of the problems. But I just want to say, you're right. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I know you wanted to follow up.
Yeah, I mean, in order for them to recall the near-death experience, would memory have to be taking place? So, even if you were to leave the body, your brain wouldn't have recorded that because your brain wasn't there to record it, right?
Right.
So, in order to recall something, your brain has to record the recollection of the memory.
Right.
So even if it seems like it would have to occur either after the thing, because your brain couldn't.
Well, let me.
remember,
Okay, you're raising a bunch of interesting questions. I try and put my mind around some of them. Yes, when people talk about OBEs, or out-of-body experience, they talk about floating or seeing their body on the operating table or from above. They have an experience as of floating above their body. But now, is it really true that they're floating above their body? That's a separate question. So they have this experience. Many people, again, don't make that distinction. They point out, lots of people have out-of-body experiences, so they must be real, and that must show that our mind is not our brain. But it doesn't show that at all. It seems as if I'm floating above my body. But I might not be. I mean, now, there's a study that also we supported where this physician is putting monitors in rooms in a cardiac intensive care ward, so people come in having had a heart attack or a cardiac event and they're unconscious, and the screen is not visible physically from the bed. And then a number is flashed or a number of numbers randomly. And then when the individual gets up, recovers, not all do, but we hope that they do, they're asked, did you see a number? Or did they volunteer? Oh, I saw the number 17. That would be at least some evidence that you could float above your body because you can't physically see it. It wouldn't be decisive evidence because someone like me, I'm always going to be skeptical. Did the nurse tell him? And Sam Parnia, the guy who is doing this research, told me that they have to be super careful to double, triple blind these because when they first did this in Southampton in the UK, the nurses were so desperate to have this come out true that they told the patients, by the way, the number might have been 17. So you have to be really careful. But yeah, but you're right. So one problem was supernaturalism, and one problem with the view that we're literally floating above. Our consciousness and our perspective is not that of our body and brain, is that when you go back, somehow your soul that flew around has to communicate with your brain. How does that happen? That's a real mystery. It's the traditional mystery in philosophy of mind about mind-body interaction. How can something physical interact causally with something non-physical? It seems to be a mystery. Is it a mystery that should cause you to totally not take seriously the hypothesis? No, I don't think so, because I think we should take seriously the hypothesis that there's a God that's non-physical and that can interact with the physical world, can perform miracles and so forth. It's a mystery. If God is non-physical, is not in space and time, how can such an entity causally interact? But I don't think I would just say it's a big mystery and it's a big challenge. Okay, yes?
So, because you mentioned David Chalmers.
Yes.
Has proposed the hard problem in consciousness.
Yes.
I'm wondering what your view is on the value of this notion of a hard problem of consciousness
Yeah.
for science.
Well, I think, so the way I understand it, and Chalmers is a very sophisticated contemporary philosopher of mind, and he defends something he calls dualism. But it's not a soul that's separate from the body. That's not it. It's just this somewhat complicated, subtle view that the brain has non-physical elements or aspects that emerge in some way from the physical ones. And he doesn't believe in an afterlife. So it doesn't follow from non-physicalism or from dualism that you believe in an afterlife. And this is a mistake that almost all of these people like Sam Parnia and Aben Alexander and Pim, they all trundle out David Chalmers. David Chalmers is a sophisticated contemporary philosopher of mind and he believes in dualism, therefore we've got to take this seriously. Well, yes, but maybe not the afterlife. Though, I don't think we can rule it out. But so, having said all that, the hard problem is the problem of explaining how the subjective, qualitative mental states can be physical or can arise from something purely physical. So when you put your hand on a hot stove, it feels like something, pleasures, pains. There are a lot of mental states that have qualitative content. The hard problem is so the easier problem is to explain how certain mental states could be physical, but those are not mental states that have this what it's like character. So I think that's a really interesting and difficult problem, and I don't know if it is scientific or what. Maybe, like I say, maybe if you studied in the future, because our scans are getting better and stuff, you studied people who put their hands on, you don't want to, I guess, it wouldn't pass the human subjects ethics committee, but if somehow we could correlate activity in the brain with feelings, somehow, maybe you could make progress scientifically, but even then it would just be a correlation. And of course, a dualist might say, well, those physical processes open the door to the soul or something, I think the answer from me is that's a really hard problem. That's deeply troubling for many physicalists. It's motivated some people to give up physicalism. But I do agree with Thomas Nagel that, well, how does dualism help exactly? How could it feel like something to be a soul? Or, how could the soul have aspects that feel like something? Okay, should we, we might have time. Let's say one more question. Yes? Or is that right? One more, and then I'll be here in case, okay.
It's a short one. Are there examples of cross-cultural NDEs, like Japanese seeing the light and non-Japanese seeing the rock garden, or Christians seeing Muhammad and things like that? Are there examples of, things that would not be expected?
I'm sure there are examples of things that wouldn't be expected. I don't know, is the honest answer, the simple answer. I'm not aware. I mean, there's not been a discussion. Because, I think if there were a discussion of that, I would have come across it. Maybe not, though. But I'm sure there are anomalies. Like it's like I say, it's a family resemblance notion or a syndrome. So everyone's going to have some of those elements, but some might have few, and they might have other things. Whether you call it then a near-death experience or not, it's unclear. But see, the way I look at it, think of other mental phenomena like depression or anxiety. There's a physical component to it, I think, almost certainly. Your brain's functioning in a different way. There's not enough serotonin that's available, or dopamine, or whatever it is. That people don't understand it exactly. There's something physical, I'm sure. But then that's not all there is. That there's maybe issues in relationships or an attachment disorder that comes from early childhood experiences, or there's stress, there's a loss, there's a disappointment. That interacts, you could say the psychological interacts with the biological to produce these phenomena like depression and anxiety and others. Well, the near-death experiences are like that. There's something, culture shapes it, but also biology, and it's some combination of that. Now, whether there are some cases where you get an Orthodox rabbi in Jerusalem who has a near-death experience and he sees Muhammad in a good way. Yeah, I don't know if that happens. I'm sure anomalies happen and things, but yeah, how we would explain that, again, I'm not sure. Maybe he visited Palestine. I have a colleague, Howard Wetstein, who's a very interesting guy, Jewish, and writes about the significance of religious experiences, and he has a very close relationship with a university in Palestine, and he visits regularly. So maybe he would have a near-death experience in which some of these experiences come up, I don't know. Some of this is, I have to say, I kind of tread the line, and it's delicate, between ruminating and speculating on these issues in a way that's empirically informed, which I think is okay, and just rank speculation from my armchair, and I agree that's not a good thing. Okay, maybe I should stop there then. Yeah, thank you.